years ago, black folk got the right to vote. You're not in any moral position to tell anybody how corrupt they are. You should be quiet.
I think in general, women, have to deal with not being believed, but we have a whole other layer because people are socialized to believe that black girls are lying.
Because while I was working on those streets, watching those folks see their jobs shipped overseas, you were a corporate lawyer sitting on the board of Walmart.
We as black people don't need an apology in this nation. What we need is what was promised to us. They promised us after slavery 40 acres and a mule. We never got it.
Great Debate League. We appreciate you for being with us this evening. My name is Ebony Johnson, and I'm your moderator and host for this evening's debate. I hope that you can stay with us until the very end, as we rely on your vote to determine a winner. Tonight's debate is brought to you by Honors Yoga. Honors Yoga offers a series of online classes that allow people to enrich themselves spiritually, along with a wide variety of retreats that promote personal growth and transformation through exploration of the power of consciousness and energy. Learn more at honorsyoga.com. Our debate topic for this evening: abolish the Electoral College. For many Americans, the Electoral College is a critical component of the United States political system. For others, it is an outdated relic that allows for oligarchy to pose as a representative democracy. Tonight's premise: abolishing the Electoral College would weaken American democracy. Tonight's guiding definitions: the Electoral College System is the U.S. election system in which each state gets a certain number of electors based on its total number of representatives in Congress. Each elector casts one electoral vote following the general election. There are a total of 538 votes. The candidate that gets more than half, 270, wins the election. American democracy: a system of government that utilizes representation in tandem with majority rule, as well as checks and balances to make collective decisions. Weaken: reduces the capacity of the institution, in this case the American democracy, to function as intended. Arguing the affirmative position is Ryan Fernandez, a resident of Livermore, California. Ryan is a tutor with a passion for education and spreading knowledge of all kinds. He works with high school students on all subjects aside from foreign language. An avid student of history and all social sciences, Ryan is devoted to debate and the marketplace of ideas. Arguing the negative position is Professor A.J. Lowe, a resident of Kansas City, Missouri. Professor Lowe is an esteemed historian with a passion for teaching U.S. and Black history. He obtained his master's in applied social science with an emphasis in history from Florida A&M University. He started the Great Debate League in response to the Facebook debates that he witnessed lacking facts and sound arguments. Professor Lowe is a critical thinker who specializes in paralleling history with modern day challenges. This is an exhibition debate and will be unranked. There will be no personal attacks of any kind, no profanity, and no interrupting. Round one. Each participant will provide an uninterrupted opening statement. We will begin with Ryan Fernandez, arguing the affirmative.
Hi, I'd like to thank everybody for having me here, first and foremost, and say good evening, I guess, from the West Coast. The Electoral College. I think that the Electoral College is a safety valve that lies on the pipeline of our voting process and the way our government functions. And it's critically important that it remains there. It's a necessary, I don't want to say evil because it's not even evil in of itself. It's a necessary valve that it exists. It does not function as intended right now for various reasons that I will further elaborate, but it's necessary, and getting rid of it entirely is not the reaction to have. I understand that in many ways I vote liberal and identify as a Democrat, and well, for the most part. And the last several elections in which the popular vote has not coincided directly with the electoral vote have all been in favor of Republicans. But I urge you to consider how you would feel exactly in the opposite situation if, say, the Republican won the popular vote and the Democrat got the electoral vote. I'm not going to insinuate that nobody is unprincipled in that manner, but I would like to. It takes a lot of it's a real stretch, and it takes a lot of open mind to really understand my position. So I'd just like to ask the audience to hear me out. That's all.
And
I'm good.
And now, arguing the negative, Professor A.J. Lowe.
I want to say justice for Breonna Taylor and Alfred Wright. Thank you for inviting me. Ladies and gentlemen, the Electoral College needs to go. Like many of my esteemed colleagues, I vowed to fight white supremacy on all forms and all fronts, including archaic systems and the paper they're engraved on. Although I agree to the definition of American democracy that was outlined for this debate tonight, I want everyone to understand, in all reality, America practices a democratic republic, not a democracy. A true democracy is mob rule, meaning whoever has the most votes wins. My opponent might say that the Electoral College provides a safeguard from electing a tyrannical president. If this were so, the words President Trump would only be used in alt-right fiction novels. Another argument that you might hear from my opponent and many other scholars in defense of the Electoral College is that it provides an opportunity for rural and smaller areas to get attention in presidential politics. But in all reality, the Electoral College was created to allow slaveholders the ability to participate in presidential politics, and tonight I'm going to show you how. It's no secret I have no respect for the United States Constitution because it's the guiding document that upholds white supremacy, not just in the United States, but in the world. But just because I have no respect for the Constitution does not mean that I've never read the Constitution. It's worth noting that the creators of the Constitution drafted this document in their own interest, to protect their own interests. The Southern colonies were heavily invested in slavery in order to cultivate and sell their tobacco. When the colonies separated from Britain, they no longer had markets but wanted to keep their slaves. Since the Constitution was an all or nothing document for the former colonists, the Southern delegation wanted slavery to be protected or they wouldn't participate. The Constitution of the United States outlines in Article 1, Section 2 that the number of representatives should not exceed 1 for every 30,000. This excludes Native Americans and counts blacks as 3/5. What this really means is that actual voters really mattered. The Northern delegation had 34 collective votes or collective representatives, and the South had 31. What this really means is that although the South had a larger population, the actual voters lived in the northern areas. In order to make sure that the slaveholders could still participate in presidential politics, the Electoral College was created as outlined in Article 2, Section 1 of the United States Constitution. In it says nothing about the popular vote or actual voters, period. When it comes to the electors that participate in the president, they're not chosen by the people, nor are they mandated. Well, up until this week, they weren't mandated to speak for the voice of the people, i.e. the popular vote. How could this actually be democracy? How can America be a true democracy?
All right, Professor Lowe, you have gone, it's time, and so we have to call your time. And now we're going to go to round two, the lightning round. In this round, this allows for an open cross-examination between both participants to engage in interrogation of their opponent's position. Gentlemen, you can cross-examine each other.
Go first, Ryan.
Okay. I'm not going to argue any of the points you just made in the opening statement. The Electoral College was made as largely a compromise between the North and the South states for exactly the reasons you outlined. And indeed, the electors for the Electoral College were not chosen directly by the people at all. They were chosen by the state legislatures exactly as senators were. And that actually speaks to a lot of what my argument is based around. I understand you have no respect for the Constitution. I do, not insofar as it perpetuates and allows for the existence of white supremacy, but insofar as it is a living document that is allowed to grow and change with the times. The very existence of this debate that we can talk about getting rid of the Electoral College or if it's worth to have it anymore is, in my opinion, a testament to the process of amendments. And so in that respect, I believe it's something worthwhile. And yes, we have a democratic republic. And that's actually kind of key to my position. Mob rule isn't all it's cracked up to be.
Okay, was that a question, bro?
Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, well, let's see. Interrogation wise. How do you feel getting rid of the Electoral College would help deal with white supremacy?
Okay, so the reason why I'm looking at it, I think we need to get rid of the institution itself, is because, like you said, I think the document itself, it needs to change. Not only does it need to change, that remember that this was a compromise between people who owned people. So if we are going to progress, we need to get away from all systems of owning people, right? So if we're against things like the Three-Fifths Compromise, if we are against things like the protection of the transatlantic slave trade, like a Fugitive Slave Act that are all outlined in the Constitution, regardless of the documents, if you read the Constitution in its entirety in the 21st century, those things are still mentioned. So if we're going to catch up to the 21st century, we need to get rid of those things that have created the unrest that we are experiencing right now. Remember that the majority of this unrest that we're experiencing comes from slavery. So if we're going to get past this, then we need to upgrade our documents because, like you said, I mean, this was a compromise, and I don't compromise with racists.
Okay. As well, one of my fundamental issues with this topic is the idea that, mob rule, a more democratic system is inherently better in any way. I find that they're like anecdotally and supported by some studies and such, there's not sufficient evidence to back up the connotation of more democracy or more direct, pure democracy and more better outcomes per se. It's entirely possible for a bunch of people to be wrong about something. I mean, our primaries they don't have an electoral college system, and yet look at the candidates. Like Trump won out of 17 candidates. He was the one that became the Republican nominee, and that there was no electoral college system involved in that. It was just pure. Well, not really. We could get into that as well, but if our intent is to improve democracy and make it more indicative of both the people's will and what's best for the country, it's important that the Electoral College is like far from the first thing I would think of. I would think of ranked choice voting as being crucial. I would think of proportional representation, even with our current voting system. I would think, I mean, just the existence of a third party would be huge, I think, for American politics. And yeah, how would you contend with the idea that voters are not always informed, motivated, and rational enough to vote in their best interests?
I'm glad you asked me that. So what this allowed me to do in my research is allowed me to be exposed to several other forms of elections in other countries that have similar representation. One of the issues that we have over here is that our voters are not so much informed, but or I'll say that our elected representatives are not so much being elected based off of the information that is available to the constituents, or about the information that they're really providing, as opposed to charisma. Charisma is what gets our elected officials in. Now, the reason why that happens is because we have a two-party system, and two-party systems need to go. This two-party system government that we've had, that has been around since slavery, where either one of, if there is a third-party system or third party that comes up, one of the two, be it Democratic or Republican, tend to try to align themselves with that third party in order to make that third party dissolve. So what I'm saying is that we need a complete restructure. That's what I'm saying today, Ryan, is that I think that if we are going to progress with the rest of the world, especially in regards to things like social unrest, how are we supposed to get social justice if our documentation and all our documents, our founding documents, are rooted in slavery? How can we get that? How can we move forward? So, I mean, that's where my stance is. I personally don't think that a system that allows for people who are not elected, or excuse me, for people who are elected without the people's representation, in order to be picked, in order to pick somebody like the president. I mean, even the small progression that came from the Electoral College, the Supreme Court this week, only does a little bit, because it still opens itself up for corruption. Like when you have people picking, okay, well, it all depends on how much you devoted to my campaign as to if I make you an electorate, or how long you've been donating to the Democratic Party. That also allows for more corruption. So why don't we just give it to the people? Not only that, how are we supposed to get young people to go out there and vote when they realize that they don't really actually have a hand in the presidency? How are young people supposed to get motivated about that?
Okay. As for voter turnout, that's another thing that I think is incredibly crucial in this Electoral College thing. I shared a little chart before the debate. I don't know if everybody can see it, but it went over percentage of eligible voters and how their votes broke down in the last several elections. And even without the Electoral College, we wouldn't have majority rule. The percentage of eligible voters who voted for Clinton in the last election was 26.5. That is a far cry from majority rule. And another aspect that I don't think some people may consider is that due to our current system, there are voters, say in California where I live, who lean Republican and won't go out and vote because they kind of understand that it's really not going to matter. That sense of hopelessness kind of creeps in. And I see that we have like a question here related to the wisdom of crowds, which details how more democracy yields better results in myriads of complexities. And that's the idea that I want to challenge. It can result in many things. Like there's examples of intelligence engines that aggregate opinions to do things like bet on horse races or presidential elections. And it's pretty astonishing sometimes how accurate those things are. There was one that like predicted, I think, March Madness and had, I think, one missed call in the entire thing. As for how do we address a document rooted in slavery? The entirety of our country is rooted in slavery. It's just endemic. I don't think that we need. I don't think we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Just because it came from a shit place. I'm sorry. A poor. It started off poorly does not mean we cannot take it in the right direction. The country, we can rip out the roots of slavery and systemic racism and institutional racism, as we are attempting to do right now, and we can do that without, burning it all down and starting afresh. As for the Supreme Court decision, I'm glad you mentioned that. I read the justices' opinions, and I'm pretty sure it was a unanimous decision, if I recall correctly. But the basis of their finding was that they just decide constitutionality. They base everything on the Constitution, and their argument was that because the Constitution grants state legislatures, as we said earlier in our opening statements, the right to appoint electors, it thus also includes the right to impose conditions upon those electors. And the entire issue, for those who may not be aware, was there were several electors in the last election who attempted to convince other electors to become what's called faithless electors and not vote the way that their state voted. That is actually kind of exactly what the founding fathers intended for how the Electoral College was to prevent a demagogue like Trump from coming in. In fact, I think they nicknamed themselves Hamilton electors after Alexander Hamilton, who wrote the majority of the Federalist Papers and was in a nice little musical. I forget the number. I thought it was, no, it's not 84. Is it 64, 63? He has a Federalist paper where he discusses at length the process of presidential elections, and he outlines, his chief goal, I think, was that the Electoral College exists to prevent a demagogue like Trump. The purpose of having electors and having representatives at all, instead of just doing everything directly, is that it's very hard to stay informed and motivated, and in order to make rational and good decisions, you need to have a strong level of information and motivation to keep up. And if you lack those, it doesn't matter what method of decision making you use, it's not going to turn out well. So, yeah. I'm starting.
I want to remind you, gentlemen, this is a shared time for both of you. So you both are exchanging. So Professor Wells, so you get this time, okay?
Ryan, what's the purpose of states' rights?
States' rights?
Yeah.
It's a necessary balancing act in we talked about American democracy. It's designed federalism, this division of powers between the national level and the state level. The purpose of which I forget, I always mix up 9th and 10th Amendments in the Bill of Rights. But anyway, the powers not granted to the national government are granted to the states, and the powers not granted to the states
No,
or not.
Understood. But what was the purpose of it? Why did they come up with it? Especially because some states were going one way and other states were going another. What was the purpose of the states' rights? Why did
I sense that you are directing it again to slavery.
Is that incorrect?
It's not incorrect, but It's not solely about slavery, and people still argue states' rights today. You could argue that is heavily linked to racism, but it's not the only reason.
Okay.
Sorry.
We're going to pick that up in just a second.
Yeah. After this note from our sponsor.
Right. Is it my turn?
All right. No, that's the end of the Q&A round, the cross-examination round, and now we're going to round 3 for audience question and answer. We invite our audience to submit questions for the debaters. Each participant will be given the chance to respond to each question uninterrupted. Please submit your questions now. As we bring up our audience questions, please support our growth by donating to our Cash App, the Great Debate League. On July 25th, Honors Yoga is hosting the exclusive Crown Love matchmaking event designed to create elevated connections. If you are looking for a high-quality mate that lives a high-vibration lifestyle, you can sign up now for the event at honorsyoga.com. And now we will take our first question from the audience. Each of you gentlemen have a minute and a half to respond to each question. And our first audience question: why would a small state remain in the Union if they never had the ability to influence executive decisions? Ryan, arguing the affirmative, you'll take this answer first.
That's a very good question. That's kind of integral to my argument. As we were just discussing, states' rights are crucial, even in the context of no slavery and no racism, because there need to be a balance of concerns on a larger and smaller levels. The closer you get to local government, the more effective and accurate representation becomes. When people tell you, you're to try and affect change within your community, usually your best bet is at the community level or with your local government. In a similar fashion, the best people to make decisions about the state are usually at the state level. There are some decisions that should apply to the nation as a whole, but states' rights are important for that reason. If I was going to finish my answer, and if I was to say why they wouldn't remain in the Union, other than that, we kind of fought a war over this, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah, sorry.
All right, no, you're good.
Not very organized.
All right, you're all right. It's on the fly. All right, and now for Professor Lowe, arguing the negative. Why would a small state remain in the Union if they never had the ability to influence executive decisions?
Well, I think that, again, a different type of system, if we had a different type of system or modified our system to more than a two-party system, I think everybody would be represented because the two-party system would be eliminated. So you don't have to just say, oh, well, we're either all or nothing, or for the lesser of two evils. It provides for more options, which equals more representation. Also, I think that, like Ryan said, we already fought a war about people states trying to leave. And usually those states that are trying to leave are the ones that feel usually lean more to the right? The reason why we need to get rid of this system, because it's not actually representing the people. Like when we talk about small states or big states, the small states still aren't even really, the people in the small states still aren't really actually being represented, because they still don't even get to pick who the president is, right? It's the people that they represent that picks. And anytime you have someone representing you in another area, there's always a possibility of corruption.
Thank you so much, Professor Lowe. And now for our second question. We can bring that up. Okay, well, this question, well, I'll still bring Ryan on as well. Isn't Professor AJ's argument really the genetic fallacy? Genetic fallacy, you judge something as either good or bad on the basis of where it comes from or from whom it came.
I believe it is. That's why I was bringing it back to the founding of the country is very rooted in slavery. Most of our institutions bear a taint morally, spiritually from slavery and racism, and in many respects that's what we're dealing with right now today with the Black Lives Matter protests. Everything right now is about struggling to grapple with that taint and remove it from our institutions altogether. And just because something came from a bad place doesn't mean it needs to stay that way forever.
Okay. Thank you so much. Now, Professor Lowe, isn't Professor AJ's argument really the genetic fallacy? Genetic fallacy, you judge something as either good or bad on the basis of where it comes from or from whom it came.
Being the descendant of slaves, I cannot side and I will not side with any institution, document, otherwise that endorses racism, especially white supremacy, right? When we look at Germany, everything that comes from Nazi Germany is banned, right? Why? Because they were on the wrong side of history. The United States is created based off of a slave system that would subjugate me and people that look like me. I am not down for that at all. Not a little bit, not halfway, not some. Organizations and institutions like that need to die. I have no respect for Washington, Jefferson. How am I supposed to have respect for someone who would subjugate me, right? I have no respect for these people or their institutions because their institutions marginalize my people from then all the way to the present day.
Thank you so much. And now for our final audience question. We'll bring Ryan back up. How does the SCOTUS ruling impact your position?
It's the SCOTUS ruling, as I was talking about earlier, I don't view it as weakening my position insofar as their reasoning, but it does weaken my position in that the entire point of the Electoral College is that there can be faithless electors. The whole purpose of it was to have the ability for somebody to exercise discretion and, as Hamilton said in Federalist, well, I don't remember which one it was, but 68, that's what it is. He specifically says that the process of election affords a moral certainty that the office of president will never fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. Talents for low intrigue and the little arts of popularity may alone suffice to elevate a man to the first honors in a single state, but it will require other talents and a different kind of merit to establish him in the esteem and confidence of the whole union. And that would be true if the electors could exercise discretion and not vote the way their state did. The entire purpose of how this case came before the Supreme Court is that some electors were attempting to persuade Republican electors to not vote for Trump in spite of how their state voted.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And now for Professor Lowe, the same question. How does the SCOTUS ruling impact your decision, your position?
It doesn't. I still believe that the entire system needs to go. My opponent continues to talk about safeguards. He's quoting the Federalist Papers and Alexander Hamilton, when at the same time he provides no explanation for Donald Trump or George W. Bush. Both were affected by the Electoral College. In fact, my opponent is still struggling to actually try to show when the Electoral College intervenes and it actually works out for the people. So no, this doesn't affect how I'm feeling about this situation at all. Because, like I said, if we're going to tear down statutes, if we're going to force change as far as things like the police department, which also has a root from slavery, if we are going to try to get away from these slave systems, then we need to get away from the institutions that allow for these slave systems to live and to survive. And I don't understand what is so difficult from this. If you are not for slavery, I don't understand why you would be for an institution that allows for and was created by slavery in order to subjugate other people, right? Allow for the people, let the people choose.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, and thank you to our audience for submitting your questions. We're moving to our closing round for closing statements. Each participant will provide an uninterrupted closing statement, and they each have 3 minutes. We will start with Ryan Fernandez, arguing the affirmative.
Okay. At the beginning, we shared some definitions, one of which was American democracy. And very important to me in that idea is what makes our democracy unique or relatively unique. And that's one of the best features I find of it is our checks and balances. For any possible misuse of one power, there's a way to combat it with the use of another. This is one such system. Just because it's been perverted from its original intent and function does not mean that we need to toss it aside. Just because, again, as touched on previously, that's an example of the genetic fallacy. Just because something comes from something bad does not mean that it needs to stay that way or that it is bad in of itself. And as we touched on as well, the system minus the Electoral College, that's not the democracy that we've all lived and dreamed of. You know, it doesn't establish third parties, as both me and my opponent have contended would be very beneficial for our democracy. Ranked choice voting would do far more about that. It doesn't help small states, which, despite not being able to compete in a democratic process on the basis of population, they do handle a lot of important stuff. Like the middle of the country is arguably our bread bowl. They feed us, and we can't afford to alienate them just because they don't know how to vote in their own best interests. As well as, it sounds like I'm making arguments in favor of minority rule. I'm not. I'm just simply arguing that more majority rule can lead to mob mentality, groupthink, all sorts of shit. Demagogues are, like Trump, are very dangerous. And the original intent of the Electoral College is to prevent them, not allow them. Just because the system has been perverted does not mean it needs to go. The Senate, for example, part of the reason the Electoral College can even skew the votes the way it does is because of how electors are apportioned. It's the number of representatives you get in Congress plus the 2 senators that every state is guaranteed. If the Senate, the very existence of the Senate should also be equally appalling to everyone if they really carried this reasoning they have about the Electoral College to its conclusion. And I don't see as many people arguing to get rid of the Senate. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And now for the closing statement from Professor Lowe, arguing the negative.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure which debate you were watching tonight, but it's obvious that my opponent is having a hard time trying to actually defend this. Why? Because as he continues to talk about safeguards, the safeguards that this electoral provides, he struggles with providing an explanation for why we have Donald Trump. If this institution provides safeguards, how did we get to a tyrannical president, right? How did we get here? Not only that, he talks about this idea of mob rule or mob mentality being created if we allow for the people to elect their own presidents. But we already have mob rule, right? If you notice, the people who actually follow the demagogue that was allowed to get or infiltrate the presidency by the Electoral College, he is actually creating mob rule. My opponent is struggling with this. Why? Because he is struggling to come up with a justification, a real justification himself, in order to figure out why this thing should be around. I gave my opponent the majority of the time to cross-examine me, and he came up with 2 questions. That lets you know that the argument is weak, right? He actually, in some cases, in many cases, actually agrees with me. But he continues to say that just because the system is perverted, that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Jeffrey Epstein is perverted. We got rid of him, right? He had to go. So if we're going to look at perverted systems, if we're going to reject some and not reject the other, how could you expect true change? How could you expect true change or true justice from a system that is rooted and still protects people and their descendants from slavery? How could we do that, right? We continue to talk about, or my opponent doesn't address, how also gentrification actually affects and sometimes messes up the Electoral College. In all, the Electoral College is archaic and it needs to go. It's time for the United States to stop governing itself by archaic 18th century documents and come up to the 21st century where a lot of our problems are not even addressed in this old piece of paper. Thank y'all, and I appreciate you guys for having me tonight.
All right. Thank you so much. We appreciate both of you, Ryan Fernandez and Professor AJ Lowe, for participating in the Great Debate League. Thank you to our audience for watching and submitting questions this evening. Please donate to our Cash App so that we can continue to grow. And also check us out on our YouTube channel, Great Debate League Inc. And you can subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and iHeartRadio. We would like to thank our sponsor, Honors Yoga, for sponsoring tonight's event. And for more information, you can visit their website or find them on Facebook or Instagram. If you would like to sponsor a future debate, please contact us at thegreatdebateleague@gmail.com. We will post a Facebook poll on the Great Debate League group page, Facebook group page. Please go there to vote, and the poll will be up for 24 hours after the debate. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. We invite you to rejoin us for the post-debate analysis in a few moments.